And how do you maintain objectivity and fairness in your reporting, especially when it comes to more polarising issues?
Yeah, so I suppose in a way this is like a really big question because it actually kind of comes down to like what people think journalism should be, right?
Yeah,
And I don't necessarily think that it's possible for journalists to always be objective. I think we just all human beings have their own opinions and
biases
takes
and
on
yeah,
things. Yeah, and we all kind of know what we think is right and what we think is wrong. There are obviously you obviously have to always be fair as a journalist. So if someone makes an allegation, you obviously have to take that allegation to the person that they've accused and get their response and make sure that their response is fairly included. You know, there are kind of processes that you have to follow to be able to be a fair journalist. But I don't necessarily think that objectivity is like the number one thing that we should be striving for. I think it should be fairness and accuracy.
right.
Um, Obviously, you know, if you're an employee of like the BBC, they have their own internal standards. They're a national broadcaster. That's all about objectivity and balance. But that's led to a lot of kind of controversies. You know,
Yeah,
sometimes you see these things pop up where it's like a debate on climate change, and it's a scientist who studied climate change for 30 years and knows all about it and is telling us that it's a crisis, and he's being put up against some kind of online campaigner who
yeah.
doesn't believe climate change is real. And sometimes I think that when we strive too much for objectivity, that's the kind of end point of it, is that
Mm,
we sort of end up giving everything equal value and not acknowledging the truth that's like staring us in the face, which is that climate change is obviously
yeah.
real. So yeah, so I think it's a bit of a kind of complicated thing. It gets into a big discussion about kind of ethics, and certainly other journalists will feel differently than me about that. But that's my kind of personal take on the sort of objectivity debate, I think.
I think that's sort of like a good take to have because you've kind of convinced me that objectivity isn't always necessary now.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, and it's just not realistic. I think it's
Yeah,
just not. We can't always just switch ourselves off into robot mode. We just do have kind of opinions and things. We have to be able to challenge them and to kind of question whether sometimes we're not right about things. You've got to be able to question yourself and challenge yourself and change your mind if you see evidence to the contrary. But yeah, I think it's more nuanced than just trying to be down the line objective all the time.
but kind of on the same line as that, there's often quite a lot of like debate about the line between journalism and activism. So how do you view this, and where do you draw the line in your own work?
Yeah, again, good question. I think this is changing all the time. There's more and more kind of journalistic projects that are um, not necessarily activist in nature, but kind of more strongly about trying to make change. And sometimes that might mean collaborating with different types of groups or charities or that sort of thing. I think we see a lot more of different forms of journalism in that sense than we used to kind of 20 or 30 years ago, where it was, quite kind of strict format of doing
Yeah,
journalism. I do think that, journalists aren't activists. I think we provide a different and specific and important role, which is kind of the truth, essentially. I like to think that journalists sort of provide activists and campaigners with useful information and tools for their work. So, I might do an investigation, like take the abortion one, for example. That I think was really useful for pro-choice campaigners in
activist.
the
Yeah,
UK to know that there was this coordinated campaign, and that maybe in certain constituencies it was kind of more intense than others, and that someone uncovering and writing about that and kind of documenting it and evidencing it gives those pro-choice campaigners a lot of material to work with and to plan their own campaigns and their own action. But I'm not kind of writing that plan for them. So it's a kind of different role as I see it. But I don't think that journalists should shy away from having relationships with and connections to like campaigners and charities and
yeah,
things like that. I mean, a lot of the time they're the people that bring you great stories that you then write about. It's just that you have different roles within the sort of ecosystem, if you like.
yeah. But those roles are linked. So
Yeah,
But how do you approach the issue of misinformation and fake news in your work? And what responsibility do you think that journalists have in combating it?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's increasingly on my mind recently because I just feel like when I was starting out, kind of, I guess about like 8 or 9 years ago, um, it wasn't something I thought about that
Right.
much. It just didn't. And obviously, misinformation has like always been around, but it feels like right now there's a kind of particular crisis
Mm.
around it. So yeah, so I do think about it a lot, but I also think some of the very kind of basic skills that you learn and have as a journalist are around fact checking and verifying and gathering evidence and being able to discern what is kind of true and factual from what is like opinion or false or rumor. So I think that our kind of very, in a way, like the most basic skills that we have and use as journalists are still the things that are the most important in this kind of climate of misinformation. And there's a kind of increasing move around fact checking, which as a very specific kind of practice. So a lot of journalistic
Yeah.
outlets now will have a kind of um, fact check process. I mean, a lot don't, but a lot of the particularly investigative outlets will have a kind of fact check process. And so I think I've kind of worked for places that have required that, and that's taught me a lot. And I've done specific kind of fact check training around how do you look at a tweet or a photo and what are the hints and the clues that it might
Mm.
not be exactly what it kind of says it is or that sort of thing. So yeah, so there's a lot of kind of solid particular skills that I've learned and built up. And then I think there's also just the thing about journalists just should always be curious and asking questions and digging a little bit deeper and not just taking stuff at face value. So yeah, I hope that I kind of enact
Yeah.
that in my day to day work, and that guards against some of that stuff.
I think especially in the modern world with like the rise of AI, misinformation is increasingly dangerous because it's more likely to be believed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's like a kind of funny byproduct of it as well, where like kind of media literacy, the ability of people to kind of like read the
To
news
understand, yeah.
and understand and engage critically. So to be able to tell the difference between something that's in the Daily Mail and something that's in the Guardian, and to understand that they're coming from different
Different
perspectives,
political, well, not just political, just different perspectives overall.
yeah, exactly. I think we have a kind of worrying lack of media literacy
Mm.
in this country, and it's probably something that should be taught in school. So yeah, there's a kind of worrying byproduct, which is that even when you're trying to do good kind of factual, accurate journalism, you quite often get people saying like, "Oh, I can't trust any journalist." They've gone to the other extreme, and that's not good either because we need news and we need good quality journalism and investigations in a kind of functioning democracy. So yeah, the way
Yeah.
that some people are completely switching off from news and being so distrustful of any form of it
It's
is a
slightly
kind of
concerning.
worrying, yeah, worrying result of all of that as well.
Well, finally, if you could give your younger self one piece of advice based on your experiences, what would it be?
Yeah, I was thinking about this one because you sent me over that question, and it's such a good question. And I think my advice would be, um, and it's kind of both very general and specific to journalism, just around asking questions. So I think when I was younger, I was like so worried all the time about looking silly or like I
Mm.
didn't understand, or like everyone else knows something and I don't get it, that I used to not ask questions. So like I did work experience at the BBC, and there would be things someone would explain something to me and I would not quite
You wouldn't ask
do.
about it because you didn't want to seem
Yeah, and
sort
I
of
I would be
stupid, yeah.
too, yeah, I'd be too shy or scared to say, oh, can you just tell me that again, or
Yeah.
what did you mean when you said that? So I think ask questions. There's never any, and no one's ever turned around and laughed at me and been like, that was a stupid question, even if they thought it probably. So yeah, in a wide sense, I think everyone should just be brave enough to ask questions, and I wish that I had been when I was younger. And I think that's just like a really important skill as a journalist as well. It's just to keep on saying like, why do you think that? Where did you get that from? You know, again, no stupid questions. Just you can ask anyone anything within reason, and it'll make your work better as a result, I think.
Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, Eve. It's been absolutely amazing to talk with you.
Thank you for having me. It was really fun.
Listeners, join us next time on Women in Westminster when I'll be speaking with Caroline Noakes.